Hello, everyone. So I'd like to speak for a few minutes about Israeli-American relations and some changes that will be happening likely in the next period following the election and the inauguration of President Joe Biden, which will bring about some significant changes in the compared to the relationship that the Trump administration had with the Israeli government, particularly the personal relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I'll just for a few minutes say something to summarize the last period in order to illustrate how it will be different likely over the next 4 years. So the period of the Trump administration was something quite unprecedented in terms of Israeli-American relations. I mean, there's always been a strong strategic relationship and often also close personal relations between the leaders of both countries. But this was something somewhat out of the ordinary in terms of the level of access that various representatives of the Israeli government had to the Trump administration in terms of the real concept of kind of a very, very similar strategic approach and internal approach as well in terms of domestic politics that both President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu had. First of all, the outgoing ambassador, Israeli ambassador to Washington, Ambassador Dermer, had really unprecedented access to the president, to Jared Kushner, to the entire team that was dealing with the Middle East. And there was really a sense that, at least from my perspective, that the Trump administration almost wholeheartedly accepted the Israeli, or the Netanyahu at least, approach to various issues. For example, Netanyahu gave this very public revelation of the Israeli Mossad discovering a certain Iranian nuclear archive a few years ago. And quite soon after that, Trump made the final decision to leave the nuclear agreement, right? The P5+1 nuclear agreement with Iran. And the United States has not been part of that agreement since then. More on that in a few minutes with regard to the new Biden administration. The Trump plan for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what was known as the deal of the century, was very in line with the Netanyahu approach to the conflict. It rejected the traditional American approach. It rejected the idea of a future border being based on the 1967 lines. It rejected, in some sense, the idea of Palestinian rights and human rights. And the approach was much more based on economic incentives and very much an American acceptance of Israeli territorial and security demands with respect to the idea that, for example, the IDF would not leave any parts of the West Bank, and that Israeli settlements would remain in place, and that mainly there'd be a Palestinian state of various islands of land that would be interconnected through roads and other modes of transportation. Anyway, this plan, the deal of the century, will be relegated, it seems, to the dustbin of history now that the Trump administration is leaving. And also, there was very much a similar rhetorical populist approach of both leaders, where both leaders spoke very much to their own base, very much used certain demagogic techniques in presenting themselves as kind of the savior of the people who were taking a fight against the elites, against the media, against the judicial system, etc. And both Netanyahu and Trump were very similar in this way, and in a way kind of propped each other up in the face of a global environment that was often not very accepting of this approach, particularly in Western Europe. and among various other liberal power centers in the United States and in Israel as well. So the Trump administration was, to a large extent, loved in Israel, at least by certain aspects of the public, the right-wing public, definitely. But something did change recently. I think following the attempted insurrection and the fact that there was significant white supremacist groups that were taking part in this, there was some, and the fact that Trump obviously lost the election and that he was not accepting this loss. I noticed a change in the Israeli public and in the Israeli media. For example, the Israeli media very much covered the Biden inauguration as some kind of a celebration, maybe a kind of a return to normalcy in the United States. So there has been this kind of sense of, okay, moving away, despite the fact that Trump did all these things for Israel, this acceptance that possibly we should move back to a more normal approach with the Biden administration. And in any event, Trump's days were numbered, and it's possible his political career is completely over. So I think that there is an acceptance that we're moving on to a new reality. There will be a sense of moving to more formal relations, less based on personality and friendship between the leaders. One of the questions that it's not clear yet is, will there be backlash in the Democratic Party, and maybe from Biden himself, from the fact that Netanyahu very much broke the tradition of bipartisanship, that Netanyahu was very much attuned to the Republican Party, and this was definitely felt when Obama was president as well, when Netanyahu came to speak in Congress against Obama's policy with respect to the Iran nuclear accord. And already, even in the first days of the Biden administration, the issue of the Iran issue and the nuclear agreement will, and already has become, somewhat of an issue. I believe even on the day of Biden's inauguration, if not the day after, a senior source in the Israeli government, which is basically a code for coming from Netanyahu, right? I mean, maybe he didn't say it, but it comes from his office, said, and I'm paraphrasing here, if the United States goes back to the previous nuclear agreement, then we have nothing to talk about. So there is an awareness that the United States wants to form a new nuclear agreement with Iran. The question is, will it be basically the same agreement as Obama forged and John Kerry forged, or will it have various characteristics that take into account some of the major concerns that Israel has? And I'm talking about issue of Iran sponsoring terrorism, the issue of Iran's long-range missile program, and the issue of the sunset clause. These were all issues that Netanyahu had previously raised during the Obama administration. So one of the questions is, will these needs be taken into account? Would Iran be at all interested in engaging in an agreement that was more strict with these specific issues? And the other issue is, will Israel and the United States solve any or resolve any differences they have privately, discreetly, between allies, or will it become very much a public kind of disagreement, which occurred in the Obama administration, and Netanyahu had used that quite a bit for his own domestic internal needs. And now I move to the issue of the Israeli election. There have been now 3 elections over a short period of time, and we're looking towards a 4th one towards the end of March. One of the questions with the American-Israeli issue is, will Netanyahu try to use any disagreement with respect to Biden's approach to Iran, particularly, and possibly with respect to the Palestinians as well, for his own domestic needs, to kind of rile up his public, to make sure they come out to support him as the kind of the savior of Israel in the face of American attempts to acquiesce to Iran and so forth. So with the upcoming Israeli elections, one of the questions will be, to what extent will the state of American-Israeli relations with respect to Iran, with respect to the Palestinians, and with respect to other issues be an issue in this election? Currently, if I just move quickly to the issue of the upcoming Israeli elections, this election was called after the last government fell. It had only served for less than a year even, and it fell because Netanyahu basically refused to pass a budget, because passing a budget would have resulted in the rotation agreement with Benny Gantz being honored, and Benny Gantz would have become prime minister. But this was not something that Netanyahu wanted to happen. So we are facing elections. Just very briefly, the current situation is Likud, Netanyahu's party, is the biggest party with about 30 seats. And there are many other mid-sized to small parties, some of whom are an anti-Netanyahu approach, some of whom are more left-wing. The big question is, will there be no party that will be close to Likud in terms of the amount of support, but are there enough mid-sized and small parties that can work together, even if they have different ideological approaches, to create some kind of power-sharing approach that would get Netanyahu out of office? Of course, the issue of coronavirus is a major internal issue. We have, on one hand, we have quite a high number of sick and number of fatalities. On the other hand, the vaccination campaign is going quite quickly here, and that could be an attempted campaign issue for both sides. But Netanyahu could use the success of vaccination, assuming that it works well, as a way to get votes on the domestic front. Just one other issue that was related to the American-Israeli issue and related to the current Israeli elections is the issue of increasing the relatively new normalization agreements between Israel and various Arab countries, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. This was a big success, I would say, of the Trump administration and of the Netanyahu approach as well, where there were new peace and normalization agreements with Arab countries without having to give up any land or make any concessions with the Palestinians. The question is, will Biden really spearhead this approach and try to expand the circle of countries that have normalized relations with Israel? This is also an issue that Netanyahu is campaigning on, these new peace and normalization agreements. And it's unclear exactly to what extent Biden will attempt to increase this circle of normalization agreements. And it's also unclear to what extent he will invest in the Palestinian issue, which is always an elephant in the room. He will clearly go back to a more traditional approach with respect to the Palestinian issue, abandoning the Trump deal of the century, but it's unclear yet to what extent the Biden administration will be engaged, will try to impose negotiations, and so forth. This will probably wait until at least after the Israeli election in March. So there are a lot of open questions, but it is definitely a new chapter in Israeli-American relations following the 4-year period of the. Thank you very much for listening.